going to be looking at my drawn presentations on Greek shadow puppet theatre, also known as Karagiozis. Karagiozis is a form of shadow puppetry which is native to Greece from the ancient times all the way to modern day times, and focuses on one in particular character, a Greek hunchbacked peasant called Karagiozis, who looks just like this, with his abnormally long arms and sort of small hunched over body. The idea of Karagiozis as a shadow puppetry is you get a big white piece of cloth, you'd have a gas lantern, although modern day you probably have an electrical lantern, and you get these very colourful sort of puppets and put them up to the screen. The light reflecting from behind the big white sheet would project the images through the sheet to the audience watching, and you'd be able to put on a show with different sets and different characters which would be performed by Karagiozis, the masters behind the sheet, who have put on a number of different shows about the story of Karagiozis, this Greek hunchback. The Greek plays come from the Turkish plays, which are similar to the Greek plays. I think they're called Karagiozis is actually borrowed from the Turkish term, which means black eyes. Kara meaning black, Giozis meaning eyes is the rough translation, because always these puppets have these very dark black eyes, somewhat emotionless. But the reason it sort of came about was because in the early sort of 16th and 15th centuries of Ottoman rule in Greece, the Greeks were incredibly oppressed by the Ottomans, and so the idea of this puppetry sort of came about as a morale-raising sort of epicentre for people to gather around and sort of be rallied as a community, as Greeks, against their sort of Turkish oppressors, as how they saw it. It was a sort of a big thing to them because they had sort of stolen this Turkish tradition of shadow puppetry and made it their own by implementing their own sort of characters and sort of putting their own spin on it, because they made it far more colourful and they made the place far more comical. The Turkish sort of puppetry was somewhat more serious and more dedicated to promoting the Sultan. It was very propaganda based. Although this sort of served the same purpose, it was more for a rallying sort of community sense of belief that Greek people could one day be free. And many of the stories are based on the fact that the sort of stupid, underdeveloped, unintelligent Karagiozis, this hunchback, and his 3 children and his wife, always outsmarted the Turkish Sultan and his soldiers and his Grand Vizier, who all make appearances in these plays all the time. They're generic characters, always repeated. In modern day, it's sort of lost its effect. There are very few sort of masters left of the art of Karagiozis, because really it's a very rural sense of style of art. You grow up sort of watching it and you want to perform it, and you sort of are in a job for your life in effect, because if you start it, you get really good at it. So there's so few of you and it's such a very difficult job to do. You sort of stay in that job for the rest of your life, and now in modern day, Greece isn't oppressed, there is not much need for Karagiozis as a shadow puppetry, so it sort of is dying out in modern day. But you can see it quite often in villages around Greece, as I have a personal experience with seeing it. As I said, the play's always the same basis, although the stories are very different. Karagiozis is always getting into trouble with his 3 children and his wife, and he's got his best friend, and they sort of have to try and deal with a massive problem, either posed them by the vizier or someone else in the play, and they end up outsmarting the Turkish, which is always the subtle sort of message at the end, that the Greeks can always outsmart the Turkish, and they end up sort of being better off. Karagiozis the baker, Karagiozis the doctor. He fulfills different sort of titles. Karagiozis the senator, which he sort of performs in his plays as different characters which he's got their qualifications for. He's a doctor, and you go to his practice and he's sticking the thing you put in your mouth up your nose and so on and so forth. That is the sort of comical value that comes from it. But there's always the subliminal message behind it that says, we're much smarter than the Turkish. As I said, he's a Greek hunchback. He's the only character in all of Karagiozis who has an opposable arm, which makes him the most difficult character. I'll show you the most difficult character probably to handle, because it is expected of sort of a master of this form of puppetry to be able to hold him with two hands, and one hand rather, and that's incredibly difficult to sort of move about with him. I can't seem to do it. It takes quite a lot of practice, which I still haven't sort of got the hang of it. But with two hands it's not too bad, but in this sort of style of theatre, you're expected to hold him, as you see here, with one hand. This man, the technique is that you can hold him with one hand and go to the next puppet, so you can get as many puppets on stage as possible. The idea of Karagiozis being here and his best friend, and then to the side, if I turn to the side, he's sort of, it's very difficult for me, even though I have practiced and tried to sort of get it right, I still haven't quite got it right. It's a lifelong job to sort of get the technique and perfect it. You would be expected to sort of have the main base of the stick here to hold the main body, and the arm is sort of the appendage, so you'd be able to move that about, but I haven't got much mobility with the arm. He has a lot more mobility. And then you'd have the other character here, and they'd be talking quite happily like this. You could move them about, and also another thing that the Greeks invented was the ability to turn sort of their backs on one another to put up against the screen. It would look like he's walking that way or that way. But yeah, very difficult with Karagiozis because he's got two appendages, and that's tough. So he can just use one finger for his arm. He has quite stable control of that. I would really struggle with that one. I'll just show you a quick video of someone doing it a lot better than I could probably present to you today. That's the vizier. I think Karagiozis comes along now. He's able to sort of have him with two hands, and he can control the appendage very, very easily. I can't even, it's very difficult to turn him around because seeing as he has two appendages is quite impossible. This one I can sort of quite easily, although I say that now, quite easily turn him around, so he can, that's the technical elements that have been added by the Greeks. The Turkish didn't have that ability to turn left or right. Another thing they sort of added on, although the Turkish I think may have developed one later on, they stole that from the Greek. Also, a massive height difference, as you can see. He's always seen as the smaller guy, the more insignificant guy. It's very symbolic. This is the vizier. He represents the Ottoman Empire, much bigger. Karagiozis is the small sort of Greek population. I'll perform just a small piece for you now and see, hopefully, if I can control Karagiozis long enough to get to the end. You've got to screw up his screws because he will come loose and he will fly all over the place otherwise. Is he screwed up? Yes. Right. So. Oh, what the hell is problem crying like that? Oh, what misfortune has befallen me? What the hell is crying like that? Hey you! And he would go, eh? Beg your pardon? Oh, because I don't know any, why are you crying like that? Because I don't know any other way how to cry. So, what is your problem? My dog has died. No, if only it were an injury, but it wasn't any such thing. Could it be, Karagiozis, that your wife died? That'd be a blessing. I'd get a rest from her mouth for her daily curses. What's the matter then? A great disaster, Hazatarari. Who died, Karagiozis? My little dog conked out, Hazatarari. God damn it, man! It was a good little dog, Hazatari. A good little dog. And then it's sort of, in frustration, if I can get his feet to stay where they should be, walk off. out of frustration for Karagiozis, tricking him into thinking it was something important when his dog died. There's another technique which I also sort of going to fail to present, their ability to make them walk. They could sort of get a swing in it where their legs did look very much so on a flat surface perhaps, that they could sort of walk. It doesn't look so, but it's incredibly difficult to get them to sort of, the way they do it, it sort of looks like he's skipping down the lane at the moment, but that would be generally how you try to walk with the two characters. It's got obviously connections to all shadow puppetry around the world because it's derived from it, from China and India to Turkey to Greece. It's all connected. But as I said, I think the Greeks really put their own spin on it. The sheet and everything is one thing because that is sort of generic round the world. Everyone has that. But they added the sort of sense of colour. There is not a great deal of colour with the Turkish form. I mean, that was added later on after the Greeks did it. This is sort of their own sort of invention of the colourful brightness sort of being pushed through the screen by the gas lantern behind them, and sort of the technical aspects are much more difficult. They don't seem to have too much difficulty with one single character. Karagiozis has two appendages, and I suppose with two hands it might be slightly easier to sort of, he's moving his appendage, basically shaking people's hands, punching people in the face, wiping his tears away from his eyes. It's very easy, but with one hand it's damn near impossible for me personally. But they managed to do it, and that really helps because they obviously need the extra characters on stage, and to have one hand for two is very difficult. It also has connections with Bunraku as the sort of their own puppetry form, but Bunraku is far more specific, and they do share this sort of technicalities between them. Bunraku sort of focuses on one appendage, the arm or the leg or the head or the main body, and they sort of, it's very precise and technical. But at the same time, I think that technicality comes across to the Greek puppets because although there's not just one control over the arm, the head or the legs, it's much more difficult in a way because you are expected to control all that, which moves, but only with one stick, with one sort of appendage. And to get him to walk along, they seem to have their own way of, I don't know if his legs are expected to sort of go like that and walk up and down, so it is very difficult, and I think although it has clear connections with the sort of the specificness and the preciseness of the movements, it's far more difficult because Bunraku has direct control over certain limbs and Karagiozis only has control over the main body. It's had a very interesting impact on myself because I generally love history, I find it fascinating, and the Greek history specifically. A mix of sort of my love for drama. This has been very interesting and incredibly difficult because I probably have shown it to you far too often how bad I am at controlling this puppet. But yeah, it's the sort of looking at the sort of way this art form has. I didn't know much about it, and to learn about it sort of out of nowhere, sort of really understand it and have a much better understanding of it afterwards is very interesting, and the way to see the way it's sort of progressed on its own, despite the fact it's got hundreds of years of heritage behind shadow puppetry. But the Greek form of shadow puppetry is far more interesting to me as a sort of more dynamic, a different way about it, which the others don't seem to follow. And sort of, I think, generally, it also has taught me a lot about the acting form with sense of presentation, because the way the Greeks sort of made it essential that presentation is everything, not just with the colours that they present through this massive white sheet with a lantern behind it to see these characters, but also the way they're very technical aspects about every bodily movement, which is very important in sort of all forms of acting, but specifically how they can have control of it with one appendage, much how you sort of having control of it like that through acting with your different moves. You've got to think about that technicality, so I think it's very interesting, so thank you very much.